I remember about the day was the beautiful blue sky, the big white puffy clouds, and there was just this little crispness in the air because you could tell that fall was starting to come.
I'll never forget being ordered to go home and all of us refusing because we thought that our servicemen and women were still in there and needed to be brought out.
It was an absolute faith-affirming time. And I remember being with Arlington County Rescue and NTSB and going through the corridor, and it was helping with that, and it was...
It changed our lives a lot.
I want to thank you all for coming this morning. When I reached out to the Veterans Council with the thought in mind of maybe somebody from MITRE was either at the Pentagon or at Ground Zero that day, I thought, okay, there might be somebody that responds. And I got 5 people, the 5 of you that responded and said that you were all at the Pentagon that day. And I'm just so grateful that you've willing to come and share your story. So thank you. And you have, that shared experience of all being in the same place at the same time. We talked about when we had a few conversations before this, we talked about there's this whole generation that doesn't know anything about 9/11 except what they learn in their history lessons. My daughter is one of them. I was on duty in uniform at Fort Meade at the time. I've shared, I think, with a couple of you, I'm pregnant with her. And so, she has no memory of this. I don't know how many days they learn about this in school, but not a lot of time spent on this, right? So that you all have that shared experience, and then you all have your unique experiences as well. So if we could kind of walk through the morning of that Tuesday. It was any other work day. You wake up, maybe you go for your cup of coffee, like I do first thing. Maybe you're thinking about meetings that you might have on the agenda that day. If we could kind of walk through what that morning was like.
Sure. Yeah. Like you said, it was a normal morning. It was a beautiful, beautiful day. And it was the beginning of the school year, so I think a lot of families were talking about getting their kids to school and everything else. And I think shortly after we got to work, things changed pretty quickly because most of us had TVs on in our offices. And I think when the first plane hit, it was kind of like disbelief. How could that happen? It's a gorgeous day. There must have been a mechanical failure, something wrong with the plane. And I know for me, when I saw the second plane hit, it was like, wow. I ran over. I was working for the Director of Defense Intelligence Agency, but my office was on the other side of the Pentagon. His was much closer to the crash site. So I remember running over there and saying, what are we going to do? And then he said, we've got to wait because my counterpart's coming in, and we're going to keep the meeting to 20 minutes, keep it very brief, and then kaboom.
It was... For where I was at, we was actually assigned to Andrews Air Force Base at the time. And on that day, we had decided we were supporting a mission going on in the E-ring on the Air Force side. And we decided the week before we were going in early to beat the traffic, which can always be bad. But that week we were at a point where it says, let the traffic go and we'll follow later. We weren't listening to the radio. We were just had music and talking and just stuff on. And we actually had pulled into the south lot and we were unloading the van and Pelican cases and dollies and all when the plane hit. So we were there. And so yeah, it was like, I remember it was a beautiful day, the drive up Suitland Parkway. It was nice, no traffic, relatively speaking for DC. So that's when it became very real and we heard about everything at that point.
Yeah. And you and John were actually didn't know until 20 years later, right? That you were there in the same parking lot that day, basically. I mean, you didn't find that out until later.
We spent about 3 months out there together. And just there were alternating teams doing the criminal investigation. It was a gigantic crime scene, of course. We were trying to figure out who had done this, and also the recovery of human remains. And eventually, we could no longer continue to penetrate inside the crash site, and they took bulldozers and pulled all of the material and everything and put it in a parking lot in a gigantic pile. And it made it a lot easier to go through everything, and we were able to wrap that up quickly. But yeah, we were on scene for months. Just must have rotated at different times.
It was NCIS and OSI, our command tents. We shared one GP medium tent and detailed out wherever the assignment was. We were like, okay, you're working the morgue today. You're working the rubble pile. You're working this, and in my heart, I know John and I sat there and worked many shifts together.
Yeah.
But it was Tyvek masked up. We didn't know who we were.
No.
And I remember walking past it all the time, going to work. And I think to this day, one of my memories that's really hard for me is remembering the dogs looking for the body parts. And
Right.
I was working in the Army Operations Center right after that.
Yeah.
I got reassigned. And I remember the hard discussions we had about putting people back together.
Yeah. Yeah. Very difficult to do,
Yes.
especially as time went on.
And to smell the jet fuel, to this day, when I smell jet fuel sometimes,
Same.
it sends the hair up on the back of my neck up.
Yep.
And German Shepherds.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll never forget the booties they got for those dogs because the rubble was cutting their paws.
Yeah.
And we were all so upset about it and just started making a lot of noise about, you got to get something for the dogs. It's hard on them. And they got little Kevlar booties in the end that they could put on their paws to do the cadaver searches. Yeah.
I think it's important to highlight that this was 24 years ago. So the assumptions, the technology that we have today, recall rosters that exist today
Yes,
right.
weren't there. And I had a little bit of a unique experience in the Pentagon. I was a junior Air Force officer at the time in an internship. And we had 2 cohorts of 50 of us running around the Pentagon assigned to different organizations. And so aside from the whole story of where was I, but in the aftermath of where are the other 99 cohort members, because we didn't have a recall roster. There was no Facebook, marked safe from Pentagon. None of that existed at that time. And so to be able to figure out where is everyone, are they okay? We were actually out going to Pentagon City door to door, knocking on, and I started a list. Who have you seen? Who have you seen?
Yep.
Just to try and figure out on our own.
Smart.
And oh, by the way, right, did anybody try to get a call out that morning?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing,
All the
right?
cell phones
Couldn't do it at all.
were not working.
Nothing worked.
Well, and that was one of the things when right afterwards I was in the parking lot trying to help organize chaos, and people were running everywhere and the fire trucks were coming. So I was trying to help direct traffic, and then they came and said we had to move out the parking lot because another plane was coming towards us. And I went across the street and there was a woman on the ground in convulsions, and we're trying to help her. Somebody came out from the Marriott and said, "Would you like to use our lobby?" And we said yes. There were a group of us there. We didn't really know each other at all. We just said yes. And so I asked the 2 of them just to start directing people over to the lobby that were the walking wounded, because people were coming out covered in smoke and soot, carrying classified documents, and they were great. They set up a room with landlines. We set up the lobby area to bring in the walking wounded and do triage, and then sending the ambulances over. People walking out with classified documents, and so they gave us envelopes so we could double wrap them. All kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, it was not a normal day for me. It didn't start as a normal day for me because I had just moved out of my house, and I had packed up everything the week before, and it was right after Labor Day. You probably remember. It was right after Labor Day, so it was the Tuesday after, and I had moved into with a friend of mine who was graciously allowing me to stay with her for a few weeks before I transferred over to Naples, Italy, which is where I was heading as my next duty assignment. And so I was already a little bit out of my element. And I went to work that day, and I wasn't on duty that day, so I didn't have to go in super early, but I wasn't early enough. I was working at the Chief of Navy Information, so 4B 463, which was actually ended up being right in the path of the plane. And we didn't know it at the time that we were that close, but I think it was about a day or so later, we found out that we'd been 20 feet away from it.
Wow.
And we all walked away. But it was a very uncommon day, a very uncommon start. But what I remember about the day was the beautiful blue sky, the big white puffy clouds, and there was just this little crispness in the air because you could tell that fall was starting to come. I remember very clearly what this was like. And then I think for my memory, there's that juxtaposition of remembering what that day felt like and how it smelled and how crisp it was. And then seeing from the courtyard after we evacuated our offices and went to the courtyard, trying to do the initial accounting and the roster and, making sure that we have everybody that we need to. And I just was watching this big cloud of smoke and soot and just growing, up and out. And I remember just standing there looking at it in disbelief going, wow, because I actually already had an inkling that we had gotten hit because I had a coworker who was talking on the phone to her husband, looking out the window, and she saw the plane coming.
Wow.
And couldn't do anything. There's nothing you could do. You just see a plane coming right for you. So I walked out of the Pentagon knowing that much, but then when there was this mass chaos in the middle of the courtyard where a lot of people were evacuated to, and there was, people were trying to figure out, account for people, account for office mates, things along those lines. And somebody came through saying, hey, if you've got any sort of medical training, if you've got CPR qual, anything, come with us, we need volunteers. And I had the presence of mind to grab my purse, grab my stuff, grab my jacket, and I was standing in the courtyard with all this. And when they asked for volunteers, I literally 2 months beforehand, I had redone my CPR qualification. And I just took my stuff and I shoved it in a coworker's hands, and I just went to work.
I remember when I left the building, because we were in the E-ring and we were right by the one quarter over from the crash site. But I remember leaving the building and looking over and seeing just that all the black smoke and nothing. And I thought maybe it was a missile. Yeah. We heard something going right past us. It's not like a freight train going past the director's window, and everything was shaking before everything went boom, and felt like the whole building shook. Yeah. But when you went out, there was nothing left. The whole plane had penetrated. I think by the grace of God, that section was almost empty because they were refurbishing that section. My old office was supposed to be moving into that section, but they were delayed by about a month because they hadn't finished wiring all the computer systems. Mm-hmm. And that part of the building had been somewhat reinforced. And so, you look at anywhere else that plane could have hit, the casualty count would have been much higher. And I often believe that, we can't control what's in people's hearts, but I think the heavens and the Almighty was with us, because if the plane had to land anywhere, that's the place it landed, did the least amount of damage and caused the least amount of carnage.
Right.
Yeah. I remember that we had just moved into that section of the Pentagon 6 months beforehand. So 6 months before, we moved in there, and I, by the grace of God, if we had not been in the section of the Pentagon that had the reinforced rebar and concrete, the blast-proof windows, I wouldn't be sitting here today. None of my colleagues would have been sitting here today.
It's amazing, because that morning part of my internship was to go out and network. And so I'd gone down to the concourse, and we have very fortunate to have that Starbucks down there, and I had gotten my Starbucks, my morning Starbucks, and I said, do I turn left and go back to my office, which was one wedge over from the crash site, or do I go schmooze and say good morning to Miss Gladys, who was the secretary for SAF-AQ, the senior acquisition official for the Air Force in the Pentagon. I'm like, I will go say hi to Miss Gladys. And they had the television, and we were there talking, and after the second tower, we had this philosophical, wow, if this is a real attack, why didn't they go after the Pentagon, right? Boy, did they choose, the wrong locations. And then not too long after that, my experience, what I thought, because I didn't process that this was an attack right away, but it sounded like if you've ever been in one of those old New York buildings with the rickety-rackety service door elevators that are wood, and if somebody just took those and just went, bam, I said, wow, somebody really shook the Pentagon service elevator doors really hard. And then the brain starts going, wait a minute, I'm in the E ring in the VIP area. There are no service elevator doors. And then the commotion started and stepped outside, and Miss Gladys just started packing up everything, locking it down because her boss was out in St. Louis, couldn't get back, had to get a rental car and, lead foot, get back to DC. But from there, stepped out and evacuated. I saw General Jumper was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time. He must have been briefing somebody, a VIP, because he was in his full service dress, and he's tall, and he was telling everyone, remain calm, go out this exit right here. So here you've got the four-star, directing traffic, keeping everybody, grounded and just focused on getting out of the building. And so that was the go out, safe, start looking for people door to door, and then a couple of us decided to turn back and go to the crash site. I'm an acquisition officer. I've got a mechanical engineering degree, but this is the military training that kicks in. What do you need? Shovel, what can I do to help? And I ended up going over to the crash site that morning just to see what I can do.
Yeah. You mentioned, but actually both of you mentioned the faith aspect of it. It was an absolute faith-affirming time. Personally, I told you guys I had just PCS-2 Andrews just a couple months before, transferring from California. And that weekend before, I had just taken my kids back to their mother and went back to work. So I remember being with Arlington County Rescue and NTSB and going through the corridor, and it was helping with that, and it was
It changed our lives a lot.
Yeah. It was really hard for me. I was a public affairs officer, and the military training, it's funny because you don't think about when you're going through firefighting school or damage control or, for the Navy, we learned how to, patch floods and stuff like that.
We never used that.
Yeah, and you don't think about using it. And in that moment, it just kicked in. I didn't even think about it.
No, I mean, that's when they came out and they said, hey, do you want to use our lobby? I said, yes, we need a triage center. And, that's why, like you said, our military training kicks in. And I think that's sort of one of the things that you're somewhat prepared to deal with difficult situations, but nothing really prepared you for everything that day.
Oh, yeah.
No, February, maybe March of that year, still in California, Travis had hosted a mass casualty exercise. And it was the coordination, state, local, federal, and everything all, but there's no analogs there. It was just a big coordination, and Travis was also the West Coast Port Mortuary at the time, so there was a lot of mortuary stuff that we participated in. So it was the training. You said when it hits, it's like, okay, what's first? And we set up radios and set up comms. The cell phones are jammed. The only thing, if you remember, that we didn't have them at the time, but Nextels were the hottest thing. And it was to hear that chirp, 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 chirp. Nextels were the only things I could get through. And we were like, can we borrow your Nextel? And the bureau showed up and they were like, here's extra. So that was great. That's how we were communicating with the teams. Yeah.
I found it interesting, at least when because I worked at 2 different triage sites. The first triage site was in the courtyard until they told us to evacuate, and then we picked up everybody and ran as fast as we could to get to the other triage site, which was, for us, it was at the river entrance. It was across the road from the river entrance. And one of the things that I remember is that it did not matter what you had on your collar or what uniform you were wearing that day, or even if you were in a uniform. If it was a triage site, the doctors and the nurses were in charge. We just did whatever. There was no rank, there were no pretenses about who was in charge that day.
Yep.
It was the people who have first responder experience are the ones that we're following the direction for. And wherever I was throughout that day, that's what it was like. It was really just a big team.
I was on the other side where the plane actually went in. And first, from a public affairs perspective, I have to apologize because, and we can keep rolling, but when I had gone through Pentagon City and we were knocking on doors and everything, one of my friends had, and again, remember, this is 24 years ago, we didn't have flip phones, a lot of photos that you would have today. She had a disposable camera, and it went through my mind, I should take this with me as we were going over to the crash site to, document, and I didn't. And I to this day regret that, because the closest I have is like my little, when they rescued the flag out of the building, folded it up and marched it and presented it to the on-scene commander.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any documentation of that. It's only here for those of us who are on site. And it was so powerful that, again, through all of this, when there was nothing you could do while we were all in shock and just, allowing the first responders to get in, but the fact that the Marines took the time to pull that flag out,
Beautiful.
Rescue it, and save it, along with what they could do for the people. I apologize to the PA ecosystem that I didn't grab the camera and take those pictures.
Well, I think that there was a lot going on that day. I mean, I was a public affairs officer. I didn't have a camera. I had absolutely nothing with me, not one thing, not even a Kleenex. But the thing that struck me about that day, the other thing that really struck me about that day was that even though I had no money on me, I had no anything. I didn't have cab fare to get home. None of that. But someone insisted that I ate and took me to a cafeteria. Someone insisted that I get some water in me. Someone insisted that I needed to eventually go to my friend's house, because at the end of the day, you still have to, because I worked at the hospital. I helped triage at the triage site, and then we evacuated a woman to the hospital. The closest hospital, I think, was Arlington. That's where we took her, Arlington Hospital. And I ended up staying there for the rest of the day because the hospital asked me to stay because I was the only uniform person there, and they wanted a liaison in case there were, because they were expecting a lot of casualties. They actually didn't get very many casualties. And so I stayed at the hospital for the rest of that day, waiting for, in case there was something else needed. But people just helped me. A reporter standing outside the entrance to the hospital gave me 35 cents. Actually, didn't even give me 35 cents. He just pulled a bunch of change out of his pocket because I asked for some change to call my family and tell them I was okay because the cell phones weren't working.
Right.
And so he didn't ask any questions. He just gave me a pocket full of change, and I took what I needed, and I went and called my friend's cell phone or her voicemail and left her a voicemail to let her know that I was okay and to please call my family.
That's a good point. I'll never forget that first day. It was a little bit of a controversy on who was in charge amongst the federal agencies.
Remember that?
It's clearly an act of terrorism, so it's FBI, but it's on a military facility, so it's DOD and potentially us. And I was a young special agent at the time, of course, and we spent that first day focused external to the Pentagon, mostly picking up pieces of the aircraft and documenting where it was. But as night came on, we started doing limited penetrations into the actual impact site. And I'll never forget being ordered to go home after 18 hours or so, and all of us refusing to be willing to go home because we thought that our servicemen and women were still in there and needed to be brought out. And finally had to go home, slept for an hour or two, and then we're right back out there. But, you know, we didn't get in trouble for that. And it was that pattern over and over and over. We just wanted to get it done and get the people out.